My name is Karen Petrone, and I am absolutely delighted to present the inaugural event of the Cooperative for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm thrilled to be its first director. The College of Arts and Sciences created this cooperative at this critical juncture to promote interdisciplinary partnerships among faculty and graduate students across the college and university, while facilitating university engagement with local, state, national, and international communities. Our magnificent steering committee selected this year's theme, Crises and Making Social Change. And our programming will pair scholars with community members to generate new understandings and action plans, moving the community forward in constructive and hopeful directions. We hope that you will join us for many more events this year. Tonight, Professor Mark Kornbluh, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, will lead our discussion. I will serve as moderator, gathering and posing questions for the chat during the question and answer session. And we expect the whole process to go about an hour or so. To introduce Dean Kornbluh, he has ably led the College of Arts and Sciences at UK since 2009, and he's an American political and cultural historian. He's the author of Why Americans Stop Voting, The Decline of Participatory Democracy, and the Emergence of Modern Electoral Politics, 1880 to 1918. I want to thank Dean Kornbluh for his support of the cooperative. I would also like to briefly introduce the panelists, but you'll get to hear more from themselves. Our two panelists tonight are State Representative Charles Booker, President and founder of the new Kentucky-based organization Hood to the Holler, and Professor Tracy Campbell, the E. Vernon Smith and Eloise C. Smith Professor of American History, whose most recent book is The Year of Peril, America in 1942. So now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Kornbluh, Dean Kornbluh, and he will begin the discussion.
Sure. Well, I always like to let people introduce themselves and tell what's important. So Representative Booker, could you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in politics and got to where you are, and about the new organization you've started? And you just informed us you're en route to DC, where you're going to speak tomorrow. So maybe you could tell us about that as well.
Of course. Happy to do it. And thank you again for the chance. And yeah, I'm in DC as we speak. I just left an event with Cori Bush, who is will be the Congresswoman representing Missouri, losing track of her district. I believe it's the 1st or the 3rd district. That is includes a lot of the fervor and the energy that was born out of Ferguson. She was an organizer there, and it inspired her to lead. And you know what? That's really a good segue into my story. As a legislator, I stumbled into politics. So I represent the 43rd district, which is, it cuts across the north part of Jefferson County in Louisville, as far west as you can go, through the Central Business District and all the way to Indian Hills, which is one of the wealthier parts of the county. And it's a very diverse swath of Jefferson County, pulling in some of the wealthiest and poorest parts of Louisville, and therefore of Kentucky. And I live in what has for years been the poorest zip code in Kentucky. And I stumbled into politics. It was really out of survival. I didn't know anything about it. Neither one of my parents graduated high school. And, we struggled a lot. They're both ministers, and I always knew in faith we were more than conquerors. We weren't deficient. Just because we struggled sometimes, it didn't mean that we were less than. But I never fully understood. There we go. All right, the battery's running low. I never fully understood how, the policies and budgetary decisions we make that are made shape our lives. We were just surviving. And when I went to law school, now don't hold this against me now, because we're all family. So I went to the University of Louisville for undergrad in law school. And, while I was there, my aim was to advocate for for civil rights, to fight for families like mine and communities like mine that have been, ignored and abandoned. And as I went down that process and I graduated law school, I sought out mentors, and it led me to Frankfurt, to the state capital, first time I'd ever been. And the light bulb began to go on for me that, well, wait a minute, if I'm arguing laws that have inequity baked into them, am I actually being the solution that I want to be? And I decided I wanted to make the laws instead of argue them. And so I set on this path, and I've worked in every level of government, local, state, and federal. And now, of course, I'm a legislator. And of course, some of you all also may know that earlier this year I was in the primary for U.S. Senate, and it's all on this conviction of ending poverty and uplifting all Kentuckians. So excited to talk more about all of that today with you.
That's great. Thank you. So Professor Campbell, could you tell us a little bit about your intellectual biography? What led you into history and to what you're interested in?
I was born and raised in Lexington. My dad didn't graduate from high school. I didn't have any books when I was growing up. I had the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I stumbled into history because of the University of Kentucky when I was an undergrad a few years ago. And what it did was show me that I could think outside of my own head. I could actually see change over time. I could see how the world that we live in didn't just fall out of the sky one day. It was created usually by people in power, usually, crushing someone else. And so I came back in 1999. I've been teaching here ever since.
And what led you to write a book about 1942?
Well, in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis, as I felt that anxiety, as I felt that fear of what could be down the road, as I was experiencing myself, what a nation, really what a world was feeling, this kind of terror, it made me think that these moments are really the kind of moments that we need to be studying. And I want, as an American historian, to try and see, what does a society go through? What does it experience when its survival is on the line? Because you can see with kind of unusual clarity what we're all about, or what FDR said, to paraphrase him. He said, this crisis allows us to see who we are and what we owe each other. And so for a long time, I was just trying to understand those weeks and months after Pearl Harbor, which is unlike anything really out since the Civil War, to try and see what a society looks like as it undergoes this kind of trauma.
Well, so you quote FDR there, so that's a good segue into the heart of what we want to talk about here. So, what constitutes good leadership in a time like this? Representative Booker, why don't you go first? I mean, when you think about being a leader in these times, what's most important?
That is a really important question. I think that this moment where we're dealing with a pandemic that has really caused the bottom to fall out for so many people, and we're dealing with the height of racial tension, certainly in my generation, where so much of our pain and our history is being brought to bear in the streets in real time. I believe that we need leaders that can speak to that pain, that can listen to people, especially from communities that have been ignored and abandoned, which is a lot of communities across Kentucky, and also build coalitions that can bring people together. We have so much more in common than we do otherwise. And a lot of the challenges around poverty and the struggles that we see across Kentucky connect us all together in a common fight to change it. And we need leaders that can speak to those common bonds and build new coalitions across party, across racial divides, across geographical divides, across class, so that we can begin to transform our future and light the path forward.
So how do you build coalitions across divides that's ideological, seem to be almost in a different world, right? In 2 weeks,
Yeah.
We've seen two conventions that, it's like science fiction in different worlds.
Yeah, it's not easy, but it's very, very much, it's realistic, it's important, it's obvious to me. One of the most important things you have to do is show up and meet people where they are. I've seen it a lot in Frankfurt, where, you know, there are issues that are treated like wedges that keep people divided. They get weaponized, and we have a lot of people in political leadership that stoke that, to be honest with you. And we have to be able to honor the humanity of people, of all people, even when we disagree with them, to say that what's at the foundation of what brings us together as Kentuckians. And I think that the fact that so many of us are struggling now, it creates the opportunity. It makes it easier for us to see. I've had to ration my insulin as a type 1 diabetic. A lot of people across Kentucky know that story. And when you speak to those issues, it cuts through the partisan stuff, you know, and so we have to be able to show the courage to do that and consistently do it. But I hope that what some have seen in my own run this year is proof that it is very much so possible.
So Professor Campbell, do you want to chime in here? And are there lessons from what you've known that might add to the questions we want to talk about here?
All right, well, we start with the basics and say, when there's a crisis, we need leaders who will say, there is a crisis, okay? Who can identify the best people and the best experts, the best knowledge you can get immediately to go after that. I liked what Representative Booker said about listening, because it's a two-way process between leaders and people. It just can't be, here's what we're going to do because I alone know what to do. And it's a dynamic process that calls into place. You know, at the end of the day, I think it's all about, do we feel like we're all in this together? And what we've seen over the last, say, 5 or 6 months is what it feels like when you realize that we really aren't, and that you really can't fight a global pandemic at the local level or the state level or at the individual level. It takes a much bigger response that requires informed, compassionate, empathetic leadership that understands what it feels like to go through these kinds of things. So that's just kind of the basis of what I think leadership should be doing.
So Representative Booker, you said meet people where they are. Is this empowering people as well? So, I mean, there's a dynamic with leadership between the leader providing the answers or leadership that works with people in a very different way, right?
Well, absolutely, because, you know, I think the best leaders understand that the change and the power comes from people. You know, it's especially in elected office. You're not in the elected office because you're special or because you have all the answers. You're supposed to represent the people, which means you're lifting their voices and their concerns. And, you know, I think in this moment of right now that we're facing, we have to be able to lift up the voices of people from those communities that have been marginalized and disadvantaged the most. Because I'll tell you, they're best suited to be able to chart the course forward because they know acutely what these struggles mean. And I think that's what's so powerful in being able to lead by example and have leaders that are vulnerable and have their own story of struggle that they don't run away from, and use that as a way to say that no matter where you're from, how much money you have, what you look like, you're important and you deserve to lead the way forward. We have to do that because the solution and the power really is in the people, and nothing will change until we acknowledge and lean into that.
So do these twin crises make leadership, what does it do for leadership? Does it make it more important? Does it expose weaknesses? Does it give you opportunities for different opportunities for real leadership?
I think it does all of that. I think it exposes who's not leading. I think it shows you what leadership should look like. And, you know, I think crises create the opportunities for us to build something new, to come together in a new way, to tell a new story and to chart a new course forward. And leaders rise up in those moments to either help us do that, to move forward, or to exploit them. You know, we have bad leaders too. And I believe that what we're seeing in Kentucky, and I pray that I can live up to saying that I'm one of those people, are more Kentuckians, regular folks, that are using our struggle to say that we can do better, we can come together, we can chart a vision forward. And I think in a lot of ways we're doing that in Kentucky now.
So Tracy, from your study of history and from 1942, do you have examples of leaders using the crisis, or FDR using the crisis in this way?
In some ways, you know, FDR could be exasperating, but he also knew at the end of the day that there were two basic things that were at the heart of this whole effort that involved everybody, no matter what you were doing. He said there were 4 freedoms everybody was fighting for, and 2 of them were freedom from want and freedom from fear. I mean, can you imagine anyone using those phrases today saying that's what ought to galvanize us? Instead, we exploit fear and we use it to the, you know, the fullest extent possible. I just want to also highlight what Representative Booker said about these are opportunities. You know, Gramsci wrote that famous quote that a crisis exists, I'm paraphrasing, because the dead hasn't died yet and the new hasn't been born. And so you've got this interim where a lot of things are possible. 2 of the things that occurred to me in 1942, Mark, was the notion of maybe universal health care. That the notion is that what we've got today obviously can't exist much longer, and we've got to do, say, what Great Britain is doing with the Beveridge Report. And the second one was what came from Fortune magazine, of all places, that said what we need is a different economy that meets the needs of more people so we don't go back to a depression. We need, in their own words, a more democratic capitalism. So when you go back and look at these opportunities, you see that we squandered them in a lot of ways, and I hope we don't squander the opportunities today.
So you agree, Representative Booker, that there are some real opportunities for change ahead of us here? Oh, wait, your sound isn't connected, so we're not hearing it. We'll give you a second to get it connected. There we are.
How about now?
Yeah, good.
There we go. So I'm stationary now. So we, but I absolutely, not only do I believe, I have hope that we will seize this moment. I think what we're seeing in, not only in Louisville, but across Kentucky, are a lot of new voices that are speaking out. And a lot of them are saying Breonna Taylor's name. But what I see is that they're saying so much more than just Breonna Taylor's name. They're crying out about inequity. They're crying out about lack of access to healthy food, sustainable housing, economic opportunity. And it's giving us the chance to have a new conversation about some of these longstanding issues with new voices in the room. And if we keep building on that, some of these folks that have been in the streets organizing, demanding justice, will be running for office, will be on boards and commissions. You know, like Kornbluh that I mentioned, who started protesting and is now going to Congress. It gives us a chance to have a new conversation, and I'm hopeful that we'll do it.
So you obviously see a continuity between protests in the streets and electoral politics. So you were in the streets with the Black Lives Matter movement in Louisville, and you saw the next step to that was running for Senate, and you're a representative and you're going to be at a protest tomorrow. So can you tell us a little bit about how you see that? I mean, often, electoral politics is seen as removed from mass politics.
Well, when you think about democracy as a project that we're still trying to perfect, one of the central pieces to it is the broader populace being able to have a voice and to affect the decisions that shape their lives. And when people feel ignored and abandoned, whether it's in the workplace or in their community, they organize and rise up against it. Just our history in Kentucky, then with Bloody Harlan and, folks that go on strike regularly. And there's a strike with Teamsters going on right now, and young people marching for action on climate change. And, me organizing and standing up was to get out of survival. I've had 5 cousins murdered the last 4 years. And so people in communities like mine have been pleading, yelling out that our lives matter before it was branded as a thing, and so me showing up to march and to demonstrate is natural to me because I come from a community that no one listens to. And what you're seeing now is a lot of people that are crying out in the streets because they don't feel heard any other way. But it creates a fertile ground if leaders can come in and chart the vision forward. It creates a fertile ground for a new phase of democracy where more people are involved in it because they're crying for justice. And if we respond and build pathways to it, we can create new opportunities of engagement and create a sustainable culture of civic involvement. That's what all of this can breed. And I believe that we're poised to do it. One, because we don't have a choice, because a lot of these folks that are standing in the streets are saying, we're not going home until you hear us. So start listening. And I, for one, am.
So a sustainable culture of civic involvement. That's a pretty nice ideal. So it's not just in the streets because the system won't listen, but it's actually because this is part of democracy itself.
Absolutely. Protest is a part of it. And, and it's been true throughout our history, and so the March on Washington, which tomorrow will be the anniversary, was born out of a fight for civil rights, born out of a fight for labor and an opportunity for all people, the humanity of all people. And it's not just to be in the streets. It's not just to be loud. It's because you want changes to happen. And, what I try to lead by example on is saying, as people organize at the community level with neighborhood associations and block watches and through their churches and youth groups, we also have to be at the table where the decisions are ultimately made so that we can make sure that accountability rings true all throughout the process. It's not just about voting. Voting is critical, but it's also about us running and leading as well. So absolutely.
So Tracy, does your historical studies give you some insight in this as well?
Well, when you were talking about the March on Washington, as far as leadership, I was thinking of John Lewis, who no one in their right mind, I'll say, ever questioned his motives or what he was about. They knew he was the real deal. And that equated into being elected to Congress, dozens of times. And that's because his constituents understood and knew that he lived the struggle and understood that he was about that. He wasn't in it for himself. And I guess that's what I'm saying about this notion of, do leaders have their best interest at heart, or do they have everyone's best interest at heart? Do they think about something bigger than themselves? And that's just kind of a universal need, I think, that we're crying for right now, is to be thinking about something larger than someone's own individual ego or their political or financial situation. We've had 40 years of this kind of hyper individualism, and it doesn't play well in moments like this, and particularly doesn't play well as we think about the issues that we're facing well beyond COVID-19.
So John Lewis certainly believed in a continuity between electoral politics and mass protests, right? He had been arrested over 100 times. He was involved in protests the entire time he was a congressman. Yeah. So, So Representative Booker, so as an elected official, you can bridge this gap. You can continue to be involved in mass protests and try to change the laws, protest the laws and try to change them from the inside at the same time?
Well, absolutely. And got a responsibility to do it. And, I think one of the things for me, because I've been a part of more protests and demonstrations than I would prefer to try to count, because you don't want to have to march in the streets because your loved one has been murdered. You don't want to have to march in the streets because a development is coming into your community that can lead to greater health issues and exploit already marginalized communities. You don't want to have to do those things. But because I've been able to tell my own story and use it as a way to inspire other people, use it, and even as the light comes out. Here, let me fix that. Oh, I think maybe the bulb went out. Okay, here we're working through. There's another light. We're determined. You know, I was going to mention that I feel like my responsibility now is to let people know that are organizing, that I see them, that I hear them, not to be in the streets and just rest there, because I have an opportunity to actually go write the laws that they're complaining about and that they're demanding change on, but to be accountable to them and show up for them, and then go into those spaces and lead like they've elected me to do. And so, yeah, you got to do both.
We were going to shift gears a little bit. Can we talk a little more about how you build a broad message that crosses across populations? So the Democratic Coalition convention tried to present some version of that, and the Republican convention's representing a very different version of that. How do you see that, Representative Booker?
Okay, there we go. I think that not only is it possible, we really have to do that. We have to get away from this notion that our politics have to pull us into corners where we don't listen to one another. And we have to get past this idea that where we disagree, it makes us enemies. And truthfully, the majority of us, when you sit down and you put the politics aside, we agree on more things than we disagree on. There are so many common bonds that unite us that if we lean into that, we can build those coalitions. And that's really what Hood to the Holler represented. It was a rallying cry in my Senate campaign, but now it's the name of our organization because we're telling the story that people that have been left behind and forgotten in the hood, like where I'm from, have so much in common with people that have been forgotten and left behind in the hollers and everywhere in between. And that we can start talking about these issues in a way that speaks to us all standing together, coming together. And I'll tell you this, there is a thirst for it. The people of Kentucky are demanding it, which is why you saw so many people in the Capitol building. They weren't all Democrats. Now, when those teachers were showing up and public employees were showing up, they were doing it for their survival. And all we need is leaders that see that and speak to it and put our arms around it, not run away from it. And I think for a long time, I'll go ahead and criticize Democrats. I think for a long time in the Democratic Party, there's been this idea of sort of running away from this opportunity to speak to people in rural parts of Kentucky and to speak to folks that have voted, opposite of them. Just because we disagree on some issues doesn't mean that we're not fighting the same battles. So I see the opportunity before us now, and it gives me a lot of hope again.
So Tracy, we're sort of in your subject matter here, right? Because Roosevelt put together, to some extent, Roosevelt had a coalition that did, cross from agrarian America to inner city America and across racial lines. So how did that work, and what happened to it?
Well, at the core of it was keeping Southern Democrats who were as white supremacist as could be inside the coalition and stopping at the water's edge when it came to really doing something about race, which wasn't something that burned in Roosevelt's gut. He was much more interested in economic issues, but not in racial issues. And Roosevelt was able to keep it together by still at the end of the day, hitting upon those basic ideas and communicating with people so that they could, I guess I shouldn't even use this word, but they trusted him. That's something we don't think about anymore. And that is, they knew he had the best interests of the survival of the country at heart, whether he went through the Depression or the Second World War. That coalition was founded with, tape and some it was on toothpicks that fell apart by the 1960s, and particularly with the Civil Rights Act, in which these coalitions broke up. And of course, labor unions, since, say, the 1970s and 80s, have kind of disappeared as a political force. And so those kinds of issues, Roosevelt could keep together at a certain moment of time, because at the very end, he could feed people, he could give them jobs, he could at least alleviate some of the mass suffering. And they knew at the end of the day that he was actually thinking about those things. I mean, in the middle of the war, he had an 85% approval rating.
But the breadth of the coalition came with cost then, right? So he was unwilling to challenge segregation and racism because he built a very big tent there.
Yeah, it was a very big tent. And, the white supremacists in the 1940s didn't use code words. They didn't talk about the suburbs. They talked about Anglo superiority, right? And so Roosevelt needed to keep them together, because those folks also supported the New Deal and so many of those programs like TVA and things that would affect Kentucky. So coalitions are always changing, they're fluid. But it takes people of vision and some courage to try and put them together.
So Representative Booker, what about that problem that the larger the coalition, the more compromises you end up making, it seems?
Well, I think that's just a part of the ebbs and flows of democracy as we try to expand it and strengthen it. The pendulum throughout history has swung from conservative to, much more liberal and back. I mean, throughout history, it swings back and forth as we try to figure out how to work together and to compromise, So, I mean, it's a part of it. It's a part of the privilege that we have to struggle and toil through, various issues and find solutions. And, at this point, because the bottom has fallen out for so many, it is creating like a very natural and a very big coalition. And because the gaps of equity are so great, it's creating just naturally this very big coalition that is centered on a lot of core things. Everyone having healthcare. How do we address poverty, access to food and housing? These just basic quality of life things, clean water. Something high utility costs is something that people all across Kentucky get fired up about, and jobs leaving. It's something that regardless of your party, you are concerned about it, and I think just sort of stepping back, one of the ways that we do this too, especially when so much of this is rooted to racism. And when you look at racism as an economic construct and not just, about biases and how they affect people in various ways, but how it has shaped our economy. And you talk about racism at a structural level, it has allowed policies to be put in place, budgetary decisions to be made that hurt everybody, and I think being able to tell that part of the story is how we can build some new coalitions, because we got to deal with some hard truths, about why certain communities have been, essentially wiped off the map and left behind. We got to deal with some hard truths about why the opioid epidemic has been preying on a lot of communities, and why Kentucky has some of the highest incarceration rates, especially for women, on the planet. We got to deal with this stuff. And if we do that and speak to like the common bonds that unite us through them, we can chart the course forward to make some real change.
So that's probably a really full answer to where we started the discussion, right? So you're really saying that this is a moment, because of the depths of these crises, it's a real moment of political opportunity here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So were all these crises, is there one solution? Do you think that we're heading into an election? Does one of them come to the fore? I mean, people have said that we're living through, the 1918, the 1930s, 1968, and maybe 2030 with climate change at the same time, with hurricanes battering us like this. Do they come together? Is one more important here? Are
you aiming at for me first?
Sure.
Okay. Well, Well, I think that a lot of our conversational issues now they're more about getting to the roots. And so it's allowing some like very central themes to bubble up that have like a holistic lens to them. So this conversation about a Green New Deal, regardless of what you care about the title of it, really deals with a lot of holistic issues that affect our environment. I mean, it talks about housing and declining industries and, environmental injustice and racism, health disparities, higher wages for jobs, and how we can advance our economy and have sustainable environments across Kentucky. So I think that's why you're hearing a lot of people champion like these big, broad vision types of policy areas, because so many of us are much more connected to the heart. Like we're not just okay with dealing with programs that scratch the surface. We want to deal with the fact that communities have been impoverished for generations. And that was really the central theme in my campaign. People ask me, well, why are you running? Why are you a legislator? I want to end poverty. That's what I want to do. And as an issue, poverty deals with public safety, it deals with healthcare, it deals with your environment, and all of those things. And so I think that's where we're at now. And we're digging deep, and we need to.
So, Professor Campbell, is the crises of depression and war in the 30s and 40s similar in that these issues, really complicated issues come together in this way?
It could have, but one of my earliest memories, Mark, I was 6 years old in 1968. And I remember one day the men in my neighborhood were kind of getting together and they had these looks on their faces. And I wanted to hear what they were saying. And they were saying, we got to get our guns because George Wallace is coming to town. And when he does, and they start listing all the racial slurs and hippies, they're going to come for our homes. We've got to make sure that we protect ourselves. So I was 6 years old and I was scared to death. I was looking out my window at night seeing, are they here yet? And the same themes of these kind of unleashed by George Wallace, I've seen over the last few nights, particularly with the couple from St. Louis, saying that this is the real fear. So we're looking at an election that's kind of grounded in fear. What do you fear the most? Do you fear 4 more years of Donald Trump and the erosion of democratic values? Do you fear what our Attorney General said was anarchy that would result in places like Louisville and Lexington and in our suburbs? And this is the kind of thing that's making me feel a lot like I felt in 1968.
Well, I'm a little older than you, Tracy, and one of my first memories of political memories is actually watching the Democratic National Convention in 1968 on TV, and the National Guardsmen put a grenade launcher into the window of this woman who was driving there to try to find their kid in Grant Park. And, that was a really horrifying image for me for a long time. I think we're probably at a moment where, the story of 7 shots, someone being choked to death on the street, broken into a house with guns blazing, or 7 shots in the back. This generation, growing up today is never going to forget this level of violence. It seems to me that this has crystallized a lot of the issues, as Representative Booker says, across lines, right? This brings it home. This is about, life and death in real ways. So I'm not supposed to be I'm not supposed to be moderating here. So we have a few. Karen, do we have any of the questions you want to bring in here?
Yeah, there are several really good questions. So I'm ready to pose them. So the first one, Michelle Harrison is putting Representative Booker on the spot. Will you run for office again, and which one?
We promised that we weren't going to put him on the spot.
Well, hey Michelle, thank you for the question. I do not believe that I've run my last race. I know we have so much work to do, and I'm inspired by what we've been able to do already in my time in the State House and even in this run this year. And so Hood to the Holler for me as an organization is a way to say that I'm committed to this fight for the rest of my life. And, you know, I have, you got to be a certain level of crazy to go into public service. And I hope that we all feel a certain level of crazy because we're dealing with such incredible times. But I wouldn't be surprised if you see me on the ballot again in the future. So stay tuned for that.
So how can you say more about that? Because I think from academics, you know, we don't expose ourselves to the type of attack and lies and commercials and what's going on. So how do you deal with that? I think we'd really all like to know. How do you just put it aside? Do you really have to be crazy to be able to put yourself through this?
Well, you know, I think there's a spectrum of insanity here, and for me, it's more about having the audacity to believe things can be different when, you know, when you haven't seen it, or when a lot of what you see reinforces a status quo that's different than what you'd like to see. But, you know, standing up to lead it's what we do as Kentuckians. And for me, it is a very rational thing. You know, I want to do my part of helping more people run for office, to break down the stigma and the barriers that make it feel like, oh, that's for someone else, you know. But it is hard, you know, and especially for someone like me, I'm really vulnerable. Like, I tell a lot of my story. I put my heart out there, and when you do that in politics, you know, folks will want to step on it. And you know, what I tell people all the time is, you have to know your why. You got to know why you're showing up. You got to know why you're doing this. And if you're doing it for the people, if you're doing it for the right reasons, you'll keep fighting even when it gets tough. And my why is actually on the other side of this laptop. My daughters are here, and you might have heard some ruffling in the background. I got a 12-year-old and a 4-year-old, and you know, the reason I'm going to keep showing up is because I owe it to them for everything that they've done for me.
So Tracy, this nastiness isn't new, right? You've studied 19th century politics too.
Yeah, did you say that academics aren't used to attacks? Have you not been to a faculty meeting recently? I mean...
Yeah, no, we're not trading places, I'll tell you that.
I'm afraid to open my email sometimes. Yeah, if there's one thing we can say as historians, these notions of these kinds of underlying fears, of the amount of misinformation and you know, silliness that's out there, it's nothing new. We've been dealing with, they've been percolating under the surface for a long time. They've just come to the surface and it kind of erupted over the last few months. But it's not like we can return to normal. That phrase, I don't know if you've heard it, Representative Booker, someday we're just going to go back to normal. Well, that's not acceptable, because those longer running issues aren't just going to kind of be put away nice and neat. They are going to keep existing and flowering and growing in their intensity.
Actually, we do have a question about conspiracy theories. Eladio Bobadilla, who's our colleague, has a question about the problem of conspiracy theories across the country. Of course, we believe in the power of knowledge and education, but what do we do about people, groups, and entire movements that refuse to believe in empirical research, in science and reality, and who instead seek to make sense of the world through falsehoods and conspiracies? And how do we meet these people where they are?
Representative Booker, how do you deal with this?
Yeah, no, I deal with that every day. You know, I think, I'll phrase it this way. It's something I regularly say, that every day, hate and racism get out of the bed, put their clothes on and get to work. And so must we. You know, I think part of this is us knowing that the work never ends. And as hard as we fight to uplift the truth and to, you know, uplift people across Kentucky, across the country, there's going to always be interests that are counter to that for various reasons. And, you know, for me, it is just a matter of continuing to show up. We have to keep showing up. We have to keep doing the work. And as we make progress, we can't rest in it. We got to keep pushing, you know, and I think that's just the best advice that I could give. I'm sitting in here in Washington now thinking about Congressman Lewis, you know, as the professor mentioned, that he talked about being a good troublemaker, and he continued to cause good trouble up until his last day, because we're doing the work of generations, you know, and I think once you know that, you know, we can build that strength within ourselves to hang in there when the times get tough. And, you know, all the ideas of fake news and all the conspiracies that get weaponized, it's exhausting. It is, but we gotta keep showing up anyhow.
Yeah, Isabel Wilkerson, I don't know if you've read her book, Caste, C-A-S-T-E, that just came out. It's a terrific book. It says the process of dehumanizing someone, it necessarily requires a war against truth. And, you know, Mark, I'm gonna really kind of just date myself. I got out Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style. He wrote in 1965, and he said, the distinguishing thing about the paranoid style in America is not that its exponents see conspiracies or plots here and there, but they regard it as vast or gigantic conspiracies as the motive force in historical events. And it's like this whole notion of the conspiracy and what they're reading on Facebook. It sounds like we're back in the 1960s, and Richard Hofstadter sounds like he's writing in yesterday's newspaper.
I think that's really striking. That's more than a half century ago. And he was writing about the 19th century, right, and talking about this. So he was writing about American history.
I'm going to turn a little bit here to the question of the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a question for Representative Booker. Do you feel that Governor Beshear has provided sufficient leadership in regards to bringing justice for Breonna Taylor? Again, I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, you know, I think that what he has been doing up to this point in the midst of this pandemic is certainly commendable. But I'll put it this way, and I'll bring myself into it as a legislator. We all have to do some soul searching on how we show up in this moment, because it is inexcusable for someone to have their door kicked in and be killed in their home, and us still be, you know, over 100 days, still just waiting to get any idea of what happens next. And, you know, I've pushed on the governor before he came into office and while he's there to be active and have a voice on issues of racism at a structural level. And he's been doing more of that. He needs to do a whole lot more of that, and I tell him that. So this isn't anything that's new to him. But I think everyone across Kentucky should be demanding all of our elected officials, especially our attorney general and certainly our governor, to be responsive to the cries in the community, not only to make sure that justice is rendered in the incident, in the case involving Breonna Taylor specifically, but big picture. Why is that even an occurrence that can happen in the Commonwealth of Kentucky? We need to be demanding accountability from our elected officials on that level of the issues as well.
Great, thank you. We really have a lot of good questions, and they're coming in pretty quickly here. So here's one from Alex Steckler that was in the chat. When there's a lack of leadership in elected office, is there a vacuum or a space for alternate leadership or at alternate institutions?
Yes. Yes. I think that's why we can't sit down, you know, because when those voids come, when those vacuums happen, like I was saying earlier, there's always going to be an interest that's going to exploit it, you know, and unfortunately, because I mean, that's not how I was raised. That's not how I see the world. I don't understand it at a personal level, but it's real and it does happen, which is why I believe we have to find ways to lead ourselves. And I'm trying to do that by example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think this is a more fine-grained question. You've talked about making those connections sort of throughout the state. The question from Howard Johnson is, how can we as Democrats move back to talk to people in rural areas because the policies will help those people, because of the policies that help those people? Do you have a kind of, can you make a kind of more, a sort of more policy-based answer to that?
Well, as far as encouraging more people to talk across, the divides, I mean, beyond well, I'll say a policy point that allows for that, for instance, is healthcare. It is something that we all deal with, and Kentucky has a lot of negative indicators when it comes to health outcomes. Mm-hmm. It's something that is not concentrated in any one party. And so it gives us the chance to build new coalitions. Like an example of that, some work that I've done in the State House around access and prescription costs, lowering prescription costs and capping the monthly copay. We had bipartisan support. Actually, in this last session, we had, I think, close to over 60 co-sponsors in the House for legislation to cap monthly copays. Mm-hmm. Bipartisan support. I mean, we could have passed it if leadership brought it for a vote. And it's because those types of issues cut through the noise. And we have a lot of opportunity to do those types of things. Because I'll tell you this is the last thing I'll say. From being in the legislature and working in every level of government, we agree on the majority of issues. It's when politics come in and folks get in their corners. But on the majority of things, fully investing in education, funding education, that's another one that the majority of folks agree on until politics come in. And that's why we need the people to help push on elected officials to not play those political games, to do right by the people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So this question, I'm going to read it verbatim because it's interesting. It's from an anonymous attendee who says that I get very frustrated and discouraged when I see videos of people of color being confronted for being in a certain neighborhood or on their job. At times, people are prohibited from working or followed to their residence to prove it's their residence. It's harassment. I want to know how to deal with the Karens without stepping outside of my beliefs and being a good role model for my children. Any ideas on that?
Is that for me?
Yeah, that's well, yeah.
Okay. One, I
could be for Tracy too.
yeah. I want to dominate all the questions because I could talk on this stuff all day too.
Yeah.
But let me be quicker on this one. First of all, I honor and respect the fact that you're frustrated and that it pains you to see it, and I appreciate that because it is a pain that I feel too. I think one of the things we have to continue to do within our own circles is shine the light on that truth, and we got to be able to have uncomfortable conversations with the people we care about. I mean, let's start there. And if we all begin to do that, it's relational organizing. That's what that is. If we start to talk to the people around us, it can have a ripple effect, and we can start to change things that, for instance, you should not be able to call law enforcement and make these types of frivolous complaints just because you know that a Black or brown body is more likely to be hurt by law enforcement, and you're going to use that as a weapon against them. That's unacceptable. And the more we have those types of conversations, one, it's not right for law enforcement. It's not right to put them in that type of situation. And two, you're threatening the life of someone else. And if we start to have these conversations in our circles, we can begin to push for change that way. But thank you for sharing your frustration because I feel it too.
So we have a question about your plans in the next couple of months. Are you going to be campaigning for the Amy McGrath between now and the election?
So I've endorsed her, and I'm doing the work right now. So we're not waiting. One of the things that I'm doing now is working to register new voters, especially folks who got their rights restored from that executive order from Governor Beshear, because we know, I think it's probably conservative, that around 75,000 folks still that qualify haven't registered, and they might not even know. And so I'm trying to do that work so that we can make sure that more people are able to vote in this upcoming election. But I'm fully committed to it, and I'm gonna do everything I can. You can count on that.
Thank you. Yeah, the questions are tilted toward Representative Booker. So we have although I think this one can be for Dr. Campbell will have something very interesting to say about this, which is in trying to affect change as a politician or thinking about politics and through political means such as legislation, how can one combat the pervasive influence of money in politics? Tracy, you want to take a stab at that one first?
Well, first of all, I know what Mitzi Gaynor felt like when she was on the Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles. It's like, But Louis Brandeis, and here's throwing a Louisville person to you, said you either can have democracy or concentrated wealth. You can't have both. And elections are often about the power of that concentrated wealth, and it is overwhelming at times. So that's going to be part of this whole discussion as well, about how to make democracy, respond. We know from a lot of studies that what public opinion polls tell us that people want isn't as important as how much money is spent in a given election. And that's not democratic in any way.
Yeah. Representative Booker, do you want to chime in there?
Yeah, well, I believe that the best way to combat all the money in politics is to leverage where the power really is, and it's in people. If we do the work, and honestly, and this is on all political parties at this point, that we haven't organized people. We haven't created new pathways for more voices to be heard in the democratic process. So much of it has been around just showing up in the areas that typically vote, show up there around election time, ask them to vote like you always do, and then disappear after the election. We haven't done the work of building infrastructure and uplifting more people. And it's allowed for this dynamic of big money to really just control the narrative. And like in Frankfurt, we see it a lot where, the interest on who's lobbying for legislation comes down to who's spending a whole lot of money in Frankfurt to do it. And which is why I'm trying to, with Hood to the Holler, train citizen lobbyists, where we are helping more regular folks be able to have their voice heard. And I believe our campaign was in a lot of ways proved by example, because we were outspent by a massive degree. And, Amy, who, again, I'm going to do everything I can to help make sure she's successful, because the big picture, I understand. We all realize, and this isn't a partisan statement, but we get rid of someone who calls himself the Grim Reaper, we got a better shot at a whole lot of things. But that said, in this primary, her campaign was the most well-funded in history. And what we were able to do was in large measure because we spoke to people and made them feel seen and helped and gave them the opportunity to lead. So if we do that, we can get more people in office that will address Citizens United, that will help get big money out of politics. And we got to do that.
Okay, so we're getting to the end here, and I have two questions left. So what I'd like to do is ask both of them and let both panelists reflect, and then we'll go ahead and close up. So here are the questions. One is specifically for Representative Booker. What would you say you learned most from the Senate primary, and how will you take that knowledge going forward? And then the second question, which it was for both, is there's a passion for change, and we know change doesn't happen overnight. So how do we make gradual change, or how do we successfully make change when people have to keep on working at it? So I'll let Tracy, do you want to address maybe the second question first, and then
yeah, my answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the big issue. If we can equate that kind of passion into change, but how do we get there right now? I'm struggling with myself, because as I'm looking at periods of American history, I'm looking at those moments no more in terms of crisis, but those times when things are going really well and how we squander those opportunities. I would just simply say that people need to see themselves inside those democratic moments and participating in things, having things to do, whether it's a rubber scrap drive or helping make, 1942, or building masks or ventilators or doing something to help someone in your neighborhood. Those are the kind of things that can be sustained. We got to quit thinking in terms of just elections, and that once the election is over, we can forget about this for the next 2 or 4 years. It's something that is truly at the heart of what we are. And if FDR is right that this is a moment to see who we are and what we owe each other, we need to start asking that question, I think, in our daily lives.
Representative Booker, the last word to you.
Yeah, well, I just want to say what the professor said was well put. And for me, the way I've defined that is we are the change, and if we begin to see, one, we understand the change is needed, and we see ourselves as that change, everything we start to do will be leading towards that solution. And again, it's understanding that's the work of generations. We're all doing our part to bend the arc. And I think one of the lessons that I learned, and it was more of an affirmation than it was a lesson, but I knew this in theory, and I've seen it in smaller versions of directed fish and wildlife and working across Kentucky and doing my work as a legislator. But one of the things that was reaffirmed for me is when you show up and you show love and you listen to people, even in the places where folks would typically say, don't go there, or in the rooms where so much disagreement is what usually would come. If you show up with love and speak your truth, but listen, you can walk out with new bonds and new relationships and new coalitions. That is also why my faith is so restored, because this is something that you probably knew, but you may not have heard, certainly not from me, is that when I was running for Senate, there were folks that were saying that, well, Kentuckians wouldn't vote for me because I'm Black. And when I would show up in Estill, when I'd show up in Letcher, when I'd show up in Paducah, and when I show up, in Christian County, and, have these conversations, my identity would get reaffirmed. And everywhere I went, I met family. That's what I'm going to take with me. And I'm grateful for that. And that's why I believe as Kentuckians, we're ready to seize this moment to build a better future.
Well, those are wonderful words to leave us with. I want to thank Representative Booker, Professor Campbell, Dean Kornbluh for a really stimulating evening. And thank you so much for making the first event for the Cooperative for the Humanities and Social Sciences so special. So thank you very much to all of you. And I hope to see both all of you and the whole audience in the future. Thank you so much.